Yes, let's talk about the way we're going to food humankind in the future, and innovation will be involved. We'll see how we can do that very precisely using R&D, using new bacteria, talking about new complements of the future and how new technologies can support agri-food business while respecting our health and the environment. So please welcome Muriel Thomas, Mrs. Brunel and Olivier Tomat. Yes, a round of applause. Thank you very much indeed. So, welcome. Yes, you're welcome. Please be seated, not at our table, but almost. Muriel Thomas, you're Research Director with INRAE and the Micalis Institute. You usually say that we live in a world which is more alive than what we imagine. Is it true for humans as well as for animals? And what does it mean exactly? What does it mean? Well, it means that if I'm using the image of a forest, if I'm looking at you, you're not just a tree, you're a forest, you're an ecosystem. And you're made of microbes, bacteria, more than of your own cells. So that's important because it means that when we take care of ourselves, we don't want to just think about our own cells. We also need to think about the microorganisms that live on us and within us. When you look at an apple, don't think it's just an apple. It's an apple with all these microorganisms on its skin. Okay, microorganism, this is what composes the microbiota, for instance. What's the function of our microbiota? You were saying that we host a multitude of microbes. Why understanding our microbiota so important for better managing our health? Okay, let's define what microbiota is about. So it's a set of microorganisms. If you look at a human being, we have a microbiota in our guts, another one on our skin, and the intestinal microbiota is what we used to call the intestinal flora. So why is it so important for our health? Because we are as much microbiota as we are ourselves. So if you forget about your microbiota, you forget half of yourself. And if you don't take care of your microbiota as much as you take care of yourselves, you neglect 50% of yourself. And when you eat, if you forget that you have to feed your intestinal microbiota as much as you feed your cells, you are neglecting 50% of yourself. So that's why it's important to think about yourself as an ecosystem, to talk about the ecology of your body for any individual.
So you mentioned the skin and the gut, and of course this is what we know best. Gut flora, as you said, it's a word that we're used to hearing, but what we're really starting to understand the extent of is how much the gut plays a central role in our health in general, and also and mostly the key role of gut microbiota. Can you tell us how this thing works? Because it's a universe which is, of course, our intimacy, but which we're only starting to discover. Well, in the gut, we host about 120,000 billion microbes. 100,000 billion. And of course, they are involved in our life, just as well as all the other cells of our body. So how do they do that? Well, for example, they are involved in digestion. This is a key function of the gut microbiota, because our own cells would not be capable of digesting fibers, for example. Fibers, basically, that's hydrocarbons, which are present in many vegetables and fruits. Our own cells cannot digest that. So who does the job? Well, it's the gut microbes. You see, it's easy to understand that the microbiota is so important for digestion. Microbiota is also important for protection. Protection against microbes that would generate diseases, for example, undesirable microbes, because they boost our immune system and they play a barrier effect against intruders. And the third function is communication. That is, these microbes which are in our gut, in particular, which are particularly concentrated into the gut, they are metabolic factories. They produce a lot of metabolites and other products, which are then sent by the blood or by lymph, for example, away from the gut to the liver, the lungs, the brain. And this is why gut flora or gut microbiota is really at the heart of your global health. It goes beyond the gut because it all communicates. Organs communicate together thanks to the molecules which are produced there, in particular bacteria. Listening to you, I was thinking about this article that I read, which says that sometimes there are more nervous connections inside your gut than in your brain. So this opens up so many possibilities and a new way of understanding those people who think with their belly, you know. We also have to look at the way we can use these new properties. Marion, you have questions for Madame Thomas, I think. Yes, because you were just talking about bacteria. We know, of course, you're right that it's something that we're looking at more and more. Microbiota, the gut, etc. So they are bacteria. So we think bad bacteria, Escherichia coli, for example, and good bacteria. So you explain things so beautifully. So could you tell us the role of these good bacteria? Well, I would like to actually rehabilitate E. coli, because in the big coli family, some generate diseases, of course. We see this every day in the news. But there are very few of coli which generate diseases. But even in the coli family, some are good for us. You know, when you are born, the baby, the first bacteria that arrive in his digestive tract is coli, and the babies are not sick. It's all the contrary. It's E. coli bacteria which actually are involved in the stimulation of the immune system of the baby. You know, the baby is new to the world. He has no bacteria, and you see, E. coli can be good. Some make us sick, but many of them, the majority of them, actually are good for us. So, how and why are these bacteria so important for our health? Well, if you imagine that you are made up of microorganisms and of cells, you have to think of yourselves as bioinoculating yourself constantly. You do that at birth, of course, this is done naturally, and you bioinoculate yourself when you eat your food. The food is not sterile, luckily. And in the food, you also have microbiota. Yogurts, for example, are full of microorganisms, and just like that, it will seed up the microbiota of your gut. Okay, so we've reviewed the definition. Thank you for that. It was a lesson in bacteria. And microorganisms, you are also working with them, Valérie Brunel. It's your mission, basically. Let's listen to what ABOLIS is. Well, ABOLIS is a company that works in the area of industrial biotech. We work on bioproduction by fermentation of bioingredients which are useful for the industry. Basically, what we do is that we adapt microorganisms on the basis of sugar and water. They should be able to produce any ingredient that is necessary for the industry. Industrialists who are looking at that are working in cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and nutrition. And they come to see us because they want to have cleaner production modes, more respectful of the environment, because they want to have bio-sourced ingredients, and also because they want to secure their procurement chain, their supply chain, or because they want to relocalize production in Europe or in France. We won an award in the recovery plan because we are involved in the relocation of some production facilities closer to here, closer to France. Okay, so in order to better understand how these microorganisms work, they have a lot of potential. as we said with translational medicines before. So you offer solutions. Could you tell us what these solutions are? Could you maybe mention one in particular? I want to pick up on what Muriel was saying. We understand that it's really important to understand what's going on in our own ecosystems, and we are far from that. Even when you take a small ecosystem, which is used in the food industry, for example, to manufacture cheese or bread or what have you, we work on a rule of thumb basis. We don't know what does what inside those microorganisms. So companies came to us because we had developed this skill of understanding the metabolism of these microorganisms to try to work on understanding it better. So we have a project. We have Microbiome Studio. It's one of our subsidiaries that has worked on an IT and analytical solution to try to better understand the interactions between microorganisms in microbial ecosystems. Today, we're targeting on a certain number of ecosystems in the industrial sector. And the applications that will come next will be applications for microbiota, small ones first, and then bigger ones like the gut microbiota. The idea is to be able to do something about a dysbiosis when there is a deregulation in your biota, in your microbiota, which might generate some weakness in the products which are cultivated. And we want to come up with solutions. And of course, there are challenges there. We're talking about very small things here, and these are connected to health and nutrition. You know, the world population is going to grow by 2 billion people during the course of the next 30 years. So my question is linked to microorganisms, actually. How do you do it? How can you actually feed all this population? Well, I'd like to tell you that it would suffice to increase production, but it's not going to work, because if we do that, we're going to be driving into the wall. According to the studies, we would have to increase minimum by 30% the proteins that we're using today to cover the needs of all this population, and it could actually go up to 50% if you consider the population which suffers malnutrition today. So we cannot just raise cattle in those proportions, because it means deforestation, it means a lot of ground use, it means a lot of greenhouse gases, etc. So there is no way we are going to get rid of this type of diet, but we should try to mix our protein sources more. We have several alternative sources of protein today which are on the market or about to come to the market. You have plant origin proteins, you know, which are already on the market. You have animal origin but unconventional, such as insects, for example, which we're not used to eating. We have cellular culture. I think that they're starting to accept that in Singapore now, to culture meat, actually. And then you also have the possibility to adapt a microorganism to make it a plant, a factory, to produce the protein that you're expecting, that will be grown in a closed environment and then purified and extracted to supply a raw material that will be used by the food industry. Okay, so if you're listening, I'm sure you understand better how we can solve this question of feeding the planet. There are solutions based on what you are saying, that is basically producing protein. And another question before Alexandre continues the discussion. There is a key question here. How can we reduce the environmental footprint? You know that the environment is everywhere, environmental protection. So if we're going to grow proteins from microorganisms, this will have some impact on the environment. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to look at technologies that will enable us to produce high quantities of proteins with a lesser impact on the environment. So, for example, for fermentation, precision fermentation, we're starting to have some feedback, and so we can make comparisons. In terms of land use, it's much less, of course, than a cattle breeding farm. We would have also a decrease in the quantity of water that is necessary, probably 30% less, and 40% less CO2 produced. So this is basically what we have if we are going to produce milk proteins. We are working on this on a daily basis in order to check and demonstrate that these technologies will help and will be part of the solution, to be mixed, of course, with conventional diets. I'd like to dwell on this topic, which is the development of our food industry. It has to be done in a responsible and a sustainable way. So let's talk about that with you, Emmanuel Perrin. You are in charge of ingredient innovations for Danone Nutrition Research. So you are involved both in research and in the food industry. I only have easy questions for you. Don't worry. The first one is super easy. How to produce more, better, more sustainably, without increasing our carbon footprint in order to feed this population that is growing. How easy is that question? How are you going to save the planet? Well, I think it's been presented very nicely by Muriel. With the increase in global population, with the increased demand on animal protein, we are going to have to find new solutions to supply sufficient good quality protein to everybody. So there are three drivers. The first one is that we could shift part of our diet, which was animal-based, to alternative plant-based products. At Danone, we have entered that area of plant-based products, and you see that these products actually are being consumed on the markets. And the younger the consumers, the more they buy that kind of product. So it's a first thing that we can do. It probably won't be sufficient, though. The second opportunity that we could work on is alternative protein sources. We've talked about insects. Please go and see quinoa. It's really interesting because it's only pet food for the moment. It's not human food, mind you, but you could imagine that you could eat proteins coming from the fermentation of algae or microalgae or fungus. And we have a startup in the USA, which offers products coming from fungi. And also, the third thing that we could do would be based on Valérie's model here. The idea is to use precision fermentation to produce high-quality protein. So this will reduce the impact on the environment, the CO2 footprint. It will also reduce resource consumption, but also it's a system that is disconnected from the soil, from the ground, or from the climate that you need for farming. So in terms of food safety, it's probably a solution for the future. So you're all talking about protein because one of the keys is not only to produce enough, it's also to provide every person on the planet with a balanced diet. And this is a very complex part of the problem. It's not just to find substitution products, greener products. It has to be greener substitution products which are balanced. So at Danone Nutrition Research, how do you reconcile all this? Well, what's important when you talk about protein, actually, it's to refer to the quality of the protein, which relies on two factors. For one hand, the content in essential amino acids that human beings cannot produce, which have to come from the food. And the second thing to consider is the capacity to be digested. So the combination of both means efficiency of the protein in question. And, you know, milk protein, egg protein are the gold standards. So we can come close with some plant-based proteins, especially soy, for example, which is the best plant-based alternative today in terms of protein source. You can also combine legumes and cereals to come closer. And when you talk about precision fermentation, you can produce protein with the same level of nutritional content as an animal protein. And in that case, the benefit is more interesting. And this has a cost, I'm sure. All these technologies that you were talking about synthesizing proteins, you were talking about fermentation, etc. This is highly technological, so this must have a cost attached to it. And food is a daily thing. It's a household concern. So how can we produce all these products that you've been talking about, which are responsible and balanced, at a reasonable price? That is, the price that consumers will consider is acceptable. You are one of the giants in the food industry. How do you do that? Well, before we look at the cost, you have to think about the taste. These products have to have a taste which is very close to the people's dietary habits. They have to, people have to like them with a positive experience if we want to have an impact. But for the cost, you're right. We're looking at innovative technologies which are, of course, much, much higher in terms of purchasing price than your conventional protein. We consider that with the increase in volumes, with the technological progress, we could come close to the cost of regular protein. Some institutes foresee that in 5 years from now, there will be similar, the prices will be at the same level. So we see that this opens a lot of opportunities. You were saying it has to be close to what consumers know. Yes, there's this question of acceptance. Do you think that consumers are ready for that shift? Are they ready to think, okay, chicken, no, but this substitution protein, yes, I'm going to take it. It's going to look good on my Wednesday evening dinner table. Well, maybe not in France, maybe not in Europe. But we already have that type of protein in some countries, especially in Singapore and also in the US, where we're starting to see startups who offer dairy product equivalents based on these technologies. So it's really an emerging topic. Maybe it will come to Europe later. You also have celebrities who invest their personal money into that kind of startup companies, Leonardo DiCaprio and Natalie Portman, for example. So this gives some visibility to the technology. But for Europe, we expect that it's going to take several years before we can have this as a routine purchase. We also have to educate the people. We have to educate them to what technology is, and then their acceptance will increase. So there will be opportunities for the future. So you understand, if you want to have dinner with Leo or Natalie Portman, you forget your good old roast. You have to go to substitution proteins. And of course, now very briefly, we've heard a lot of big industry, high-tech industries, which are located here on the plateau de Saclay. There is also a link between Danone and Paris-Saclay. Yes, we place high hopes in Danone at the Paris-Saclay ecosystem. We like the fact that they are food tech players, very high-fly players, from research to science and integration. So we really want to be part of that network. And we have invested a lot of money in a new research center in Paris-Saclay, which is called InCube, for open innovation, an innovation center that will be open to the outside. We will work with partners at all stages of development in order to innovate together in the food tech business. And of course, I would like to welcome you, Olivier Tomat. You work at Genopole and at Genopole, sorry. When you talk about the future of food, eating right, eating better, this is, of course, what we're trying to do. We're also talking about alternative production modes. I'd like to take a deeper look into that with you. How do you handle this inside Genopole? New ways of fermenting food, cellular meat, that type of things. Well, it's interesting historically because we used to work on therapies at Genopole in terms of research. And then, in the 21st century, biology became what the digital was in the 20th, right? So we saw a lot of startups in France and in the US also. It was the same, but we saw a whole group of startups who came onto the market trying to produce cellular foie gras, trying to produce, as Emmanuel said, alternative products for milk, etc. So we thought that we had this whole set of technologies and of common issues also, which can probably be transferred to this sector of alternative proteins. So we looked into the subject and we realized that this was only the beginning of this adventure. Just like everybody else, we've had the opportunity to say this. This is going to be the big adventure for the next 10 years. And of course, we need innovation, and we try to work on innovation capacities. For example, we are working on a makeup space, as we call it. It's a place which is a mix between a tech lab and a food science lab, and they will be available for startups who want to work on innovation in those areas. It will open at the beginning of 2023. We try to find instruments for all companies to work on innovation in that field. Now, alternative production. You've got precision fermentation, you've got biomass, you've got cell-based production plant. So these alternative productions will lead to fresh products in our grocery stores. This is something that we start to see emerging already. So what are these fresh products that we're going to see on our supermarket shelves in the future? Oh, well, this is interesting, really, because there's always a time gap. Emmanuel mentioned a certain number of things based on plant. You've got plant-based milk. I'm saying plant-based milk. It's not only products that we've been used to for the past 10 years. You also have plant-based sausages. You've got wonderful things, including done by French startups. You've got chicken, which is made from peas, and you could not make the difference between your regular chicken and the pea-based chicken. So, you've got the whole range of protein products which can be substituted by any other technology. So, of course, not at the same pace for all. We're talking about acceptance. There's also acceptance of the authorities. It's easier for plant-based than for cellular meat, of course, because there is a little bit of reluctance from the authorities in that area, but we're working on that too. The idea is that these technologies could be combined because they all have upsides and downsides, and you could think about putting them together and developing products that could reach our supermarkets. Yes, we talked about acceptance. I think it's true, especially in France, if you get rid of your good old Sunday lunch chicken, it's going to be very difficult. So, but for the rest of the world, how do you see this? Are there any constraints? Would they be based on reluctance from consumers, or is it technological constraints or regulatory constraints? Well, very, very clearly, we have regulation issues. This is an industry which actually accepts the very idea of regulation. It's not like in another industry where it's a constant struggle. But here, it's fully taken on board. But there is some competition between the countries, regulatory competition among the countries. In the European Union, it's novel food regulation. You know that European regulation is a very burdensome type of thing because it has to be negotiated by all the states, by all the governments. So basically, there is a very high level of acceptance. It's about 17 months to have a product certified. So, of course, there's a lot of goodwill from all sides, but it takes a long time. Singapore, I like to mention Singapore, has asked their authorities to increase the acceptance rules for cellular meat. In the UK, they also have a strategy. Israel, of course, has a strategy in that area. So we have some kind of a competition between states or between regions of the world, so that this pushes everybody upwards, of course, but we have to be part of that. We don't want to miss the bandwagon. So in terms of acceptance by consumers, Emmanuel is right. There are a lot of studies going on. There is a generation gap here, obviously. People who are under 30 will be more inclined to accept. Of course, we're not talking about substituting your Sunday chicken. It's about varying the consumption modes. And there is also the question of how people relate to the regulation. There was a very interesting study in Singapore that said that 83% of the people surveyed were ready to accept, to consume alternative proteins massively because the government says it's good. So you see, it's very much linked to how much citizens trust their authorities. You mean it's a cultural aspect that we eat meat differently, I think. We have a different way of eating meat. It's a cultural question, maybe, which is the most important one. Yes, maybe. You've got education, you've got your relationship to your authorities, etc. But these are things that we can work on. The message that I want to convey today is that yes, there are obstacles, there are difficulties. It never goes as quickly as you would like it to, but we have to work all together with consumers, with authorities, with researchers, with academics, with the panel of people that you have here. And this is exactly what we're doing. We're working together on that. So at some point, I will want to test that. I can't wait. And now we are going to wrap up this session. A few words about Paris-Saclay, because I've asked everybody else. What about you? What is your link with Paris-Saclay? Is this the place to be if you want to eat cellular meat? Well, anyway, this is the place where you have all the players who work in the ecosystem. You have people representing different kinds of players. You've got Agro-Paris-Tech, for example, which is an engineering school, one of the best ones. You have the whole ecosystem that is required to develop the ecosystem to actually get France in the front line again. And I must say that the Paris-Saclay is in a very good position, and I'm sure that this is going to create jobs. Oh, I'm hungry. I'm hungry now. And of course, the lamb roast would also be something interesting to look at. This afternoon, I've been like a kid. We were talking about stars and astronomy. We were talking about cooking, and I'm so happy. I'm just like a kid here. Thank you for helping us to see what's going to be on our plates in the future. And we understand that this is not the only issue. What is at stake here is to create a desirable and sustainable future for everybody else. Thank you. So we talked a lot during the day of Paris-Saclay, the benefits of it, the frontiers which are shifting and moving around Paris-Saclay. But let's go and see somewhere else what other people are doing. And this is exactly what you are going to talk about now, Marion, with your guests. I don't know why I've been saying vous to you while I was saying tu at the beginning of the day. You now have the floor. You're going to have a panel discussion with other innovation ecosystems, and this is going to be right after the jingle.